The 1st of April, 1945. Marines are sweeping an airfield on Okinawa when they find something they've never seen before. It's small. It's sleek. It has no landing gear. The wings are too short. The fuselage tapers to a blunt nose that looks almost like a warhead because itis, 2,600 pounds of it packed into the brake airframe. They call it over to the officers. One of them scratches his head and whispers, "What everyone is thinking. What kind of plane was this supposed to be?" In the Pacific, April Fool's Day is the day the Allies discovered Japan's piloted rocket bomb. And because they found it on that date, they gave it a nickname, Baka. It's a Japanese word. It means idiot, fool. By the end of this, you'll understand why that nickname masked a far more dangerous truth. This aircraft was not stupid. It was desperate. And desperation, in the hands of an enemy with nothing left to lose, is always more terrifying than arrogance. The aircraft's real name was the Yokosuka MXY-7 Ohka. In Japanese, Ohka means cherry blossom. But the Americans saw it differently. They saw an engine with a cockpit bolted to the front. They saw a human missile, and they wondered, what kind of nation builds a weapon you can only use once, and only if you're willing to die? The answer lies in how Japan built it, where it came from, and the moment it was finally unleashed against the American fleet. The idea started early. In 1944, the Japanese Navy was losing every major sea battle. The American fleet was too strong, too well supplied, too fast. Traditional aircraft couldn't get close enough to sink the carriers. Pilots were already dying in overwhelming numbers. So, someone in Tokyo asked the question that would lead to the Ohka. What if we stopped trying to survive the attack and just optimized for the hit? The design came from Ensign Mitsuo Ota, a young Navy engineer. Ota worked with students from the Aeronautical Research Institute in Tokyo. They sketched a concept, a small, unpowered glider, packed with explosives, towed by a bomber to within striking distance. Then, it would release, glide toward the target, and when close enough, fire 3 solid fuel rocket motors. Those rockets would accelerate the aircraft to speeds of over 400 miles per hour in level flight. In a dive, it would exceed 600 miles per hour. Fast enough that an escort fighter couldn't intercept it. Fast enough that gunners would have only seconds to react. In the beginning, the Navy didn't want it. The brass thought it was a waste of resources. But by 1944, with losses piling up, Ota kept pushing. He drew the designs. He built mock-ups. He showed them around. And slowly, the skepticism shifted. In 1944, the Navy authorized production. They called it the Manned Suicide Attacker Ohka. Officially, nobody said suicide. Officially, they called it a piloted bomb, a weapon that happened to require a pilot. But everyone building it knew. Everyone who flew it knew. The pilot was always expected to die. Production ramped up slowly. Yokosuka Naval Air Arsenal built the first 155. The rest came from the Kasumi-Gaura Naval Air Arsenal. By the time the war ended, they had built 852 Ohkas, but very few of them ever flew. Most sat on airfields, waiting for targets that never came. Most were destroyed on the ground by American air raids or lost when the Mitsubishi G4M bombers carrying them, the Betty, as the Allies called it, were shot down before reaching the drop zone. The Ohka was dependent. It had no engines of its own until the rockets fired. So it needed a mothership. The Betty had to fly Ito the target. The Betty was slow. The Betty was vulnerable. And by the time the Ohka was ready to fight, the American fighter cover was so thick that very few Bettys ever made it through. November 1944. The first operational Ohka unit was ready. They were called the Kaminari Tai, the Thunder Squad. They trained on Kyushu. The pilots were volunteers, though in the Japanese Navy, volunteering for a suicide mission was more obligation than choice. They knew their mission. They knew the odds. They trained. Anyway, the first attack came on the 21st of November, 1944. 16 Bettys, carrying 16 Ohkas, took off from Kanoya Airfield. They were headed for an American task force north of the Philippines. But the American radar had evolved. By late 1944, the Allies could detect bombers from miles away. Fighters climbed to meet them over the ocean. Between Luzon and Formosa, the Bettys were intercepted. American Hellcats and Corsairs descended on them. The bombers were fast for their size, but not fast enough. Not fast enough to evade. 20 or 30 fighters converging from all angles. One by one, the Bettys went down. Flak and cannon fire, engines burning, spiraling into the ocean. Not a single Ohka reached its target on that first day. Of the 16 Ohkas that left Kanoya, 16 pilots died, with no enemy ships sunk. 0 successful missions. 16 sacrifices, with nothing to show but wreckage. But the Thunder Squad kept flying. They had no choice. December, the second attack. Again, Bettys carrying Ohkas. Again, American fighters waited in the sky. Again, most were shot down before release, but this time, one made it through, or nearly made it. The pilot released his Ohka at extreme range from an on-bear American task force. His rockets fired. He dove toward a destroyer he was so focused on, the ship, that he didn't see the escort fighters above him. They tore his aircraft apart before he reached the target. No ship sunk. Another pilot dead. January 1945. A third attack. The results were the same. Attrition. Failure. Ran. Death without impact. And then, finally, something changed. On the 16th of April, 1945, an Ohka pilot actually hit his target, an escort carrier called the USS Manert L. Abilene. The Ohka detonated against the ship's hull. The explosion was catastrophic. The carrier sank. It was the Ohka's first confirmed kill. 54 sailors died with it. On the same day, another Ohka hit a transport ship, the USS Roper. She was damaged but stayed afloat. The pilot of that Ohka died for a ship that lived, for a ship that would be repaired and sail again. In the coming weeks, other ships were hit, escorts damaged, a minesweeper sunk, the LST-96 hit and beached. The Ohka was finally proving itself. When it connected, it was devastating. Its warhead was massive for an aircraft. It was fast enough to outrun any fighter. It hit hard, but the window for using it was closing. By April 1945, the American forces were too close. Japan was being invaded. The Bettys had nowhere safe to launch from. Fighters covered every approach. The Ohka attacks became more desperate, more scattered. Some launched from land bases instead of carriers, flying in formation with 0 fighters, trying to overwhelm the escort with sheer numbers. It never worked, not once. By the time the war ended, fewer than 60 Ohkas had been used in combat. Of those, maybe a dozen hit their targets. Perhaps 30 American sailors and soldiers died in the explosions. That was the return on 852 aircraft. That was Japan's answer to American naval power. A weapon that cost resources to build, cost lives to pilot, and achieved almost nothing. And that's when the Allies realized the truth. The Ohka wasn't a failure because it was stupid. It was a failure because it represented Japan's last desperate roll of the dice when every other option had been lost. The Americans had called it the Baka Bomb out of contempt. But contempt for an enemy's weapon is easy. Understanding why an enemy builds something so extreme, that's harder. That's the moment you have to confront what war actually does to a nation. The Ohka existed because Japan's high command had decided that the war could not be lost, even as that war was already lost. It existed because engineers like Ensio Mitsuo Ota believed that innovation and sacrifice could somehow reverse the irreversible. It existed because pilots, young men who knew they were going to die, kept volunteering anyway, kept trusting that their deaths meant something. In the end, the Ohka changed nothing. It sank a handful of ships and killed a few dozen men against an enemy fleet of hundreds of vessels and thousands of sailors. It was a grain of sand against an ocean. But the fact that Japan boiled it at all, the fact that they dedicated resources to it, the fact that pilots flew it knowing they would never return, that speaks to something deeper. That speaks to a nation that had run out of all other options and still refused to accept defeat. The Allies called Ite Baka, the fool's bomb, but Japan called Ite Ohka, the cherry blossom, a flower that blooms for a single spring, then falls and dies. And in that name, in the eye, that metaphor, you can hear Japan's understanding of what it had become, a nation making art out of desperation, a nation that had already lost the war but kept flying the missions anyway. Some of the Ohkas survived the war. A few were captured by American forces on Okinawa. A few more were found after the Japanese surrender. Today, you can see them in museums. The Smithsonian has one, the RAF Museum in England has another. They sit in climate-controlled rooms, preserved, studied, remembered. When you look at one, the first thing that strikes you is how small it is. The second thing is understanding that someone, a young man like you, sat in that tiny cockpit knowing he was never going to climb out alive. That realization, that moment when the engineering and the history and the human cost all crystallize together, that's what the Ohka forces you to confront. It's not a question of whether Japan was right or wrong to build it. It's a question of what desperation looks like. When a nation decides that honor is worth more than survival, and whether that choice, in any war, in any conflict, ever makes sense. So here's the question for you. Do you think the men who built the Ohka truly believed it would win the war? Or did they know it was already lost and build it anyway as an act of defiance? Let me know in the comments. If you learned something about the Ohka that you didn't know before, hit like so YouTube pushes this to more people. More people need to know that this aircraft existed, that it was real, and that it represents one of the final moments of World War II when engineering and desperation collided. But there's more to this story. Japan wasn't the only nation racing to build a piloted bomb. While the Ohka was being developed, the Germans were building something even more extreme. The Fieseler Phi 103, a jet-powered, unpiloted glide bomb that didn't need a pilot at all. Except Germany had no jets left, so they mounted a pulse jet on it. They called it a flying bomb. But when you put a man in the cockpit, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes the last desperate weapon of a nation that had already lost the pros. War, but refused to surrender. Next time, we're diving into how Germany's piloted bomb almost changed the war and why it failed, just like the Ohka. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching.